All right, we're ready to get started. Welcome to the Corner Society for the History of Medicine. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Michal Rav, and together with Mr. Bob Riley, who is paying his dues in jury duty today, we run the Corner Society. We coordinate it, and we are affiliated with the Department of Health, Humanities, and Bioethics at the medical school. And we have a lot of partner institutes on campus. And we, of course, are grateful to the Rochester Academy of Medicine for being our home for so long. And thank you, Sue Layton, for having us here. This is our second in the series for the year, and we're really happy you're here. Maybe you'll consider joining us on our listserv or future meetings and so on. Okay, now, really grateful to be introducing our speaker for today. This is a joint visit with our friends and colleagues at RIT who helped facilitate this. And we're really lucky to be able to welcome Professor Mara Mills to the Cornell Society. She is Associate Professor of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU and is founding co-director of the NYU Center for Disability Studies. She has expertise in sound studies, disability studies, the history of electronics, and the history of the telephone. Her monograph, Hearing Loss and the History of Information Theory, is forthcoming from Duke Press, and she's also a founding editorial board member of the journal Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, Technoscience, and she's a co-editor of numerous books that I probably won't go through all of them because there's, how are you doing so many books? But I will mention a few of them. Testing Hearing, The Making of Modern Orality, CRIP Authorship, Disability as a Method, which is this year. And she's also working on an NSF-funded edited collection, which is called How to Be Disabled in a Pandemic, which is forthcoming with NYU Press, as well as a collaborative research project on the global cochlear implant. So many different streams and threads that she's following that you can see how they're all connected. And today she's talking about the history of the concept of impairment and its relationship to the development of insurance and actuarial science, which is really a fascinating mix of topics that come together to this talk today. So thank you so much for making the way here. It's really nice to welcome Mara also, who has been doing research here in Rochester at RIT, though not here, but also in our community. And thank you for coming here to present some of that work. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Let me just get this set up. Hi to everyone on Zoom. I probably won't be able to see everyone who's on Zoom, but I'll try to answer questions from the chat at the end. So I'm Mara Mills. It's wonderful to be here. I've spent a lot of time not only in the RIT archives, but the Rochester School for the Deaf archives, doing work on the history of audiometry, hearing aids, also cochlear implants, which is an ongoing set of projects. I am a professor of media studies, but my original training was in biology. If you had told me in my early 20s that I would be a media studies professor someday, I would never have believed you. But this is the way the job market works. I did a PhD in history of science. Stephen Jay Gould met me after I was at a conference with him after finishing my master's in biology. And he introduced me to the field of history of science and encouraged me to apply. So through a circuitous route, I ended up in a media department. And that is why my biography, as Michal explained it spans a lot of different kinds of topics. But today the topic is the history of impairment. And this is the perfect place really for me to debut this talk, which I haven't given before. And it's based on an article that I co-authored with Dan Book. I'm not sure if he's remotely here in the Zoom audience, but I'm sure here in spirit, and I'll say a little bit more about our collaboration on this. I'm also it's very moving to be in this medical history club, the Corner Society, that has been meeting for almost a century. So, you know, it's rare that historians of science and medicine feel the magnitude of the history of their own field, but I definitely feel that in this space. So I'm going to tell you where the concept of impairment came from. And I know that there's some doctors in the audience. How many here are physicians? Excellent. Because for those, I know someone in the back is sneaking out early, but for those of you who are here during the Q&A, I'm interested to know what you think of the MIB, the Medical Information Bureau, which is at the center of the history I'm going to tell you, and still exists, although I'll be focusing on early 1900s, its founding. So the you're going to get about a third of the full-length article that is coming out in Osiris, one of the main journals of the History of Science Society in 2024. And again, I co-authored this with life insurance historian and census historian Dan Book. We've been working on this for about 2 years on and off together. And we're bringing together his research in the MetLife archives, which is really one of the few major life insurance collections available to the public. Very hard to get access to life insurance and other corporate archives. And then my research in the Melville Dewey collection at Columbia. Melville Dewey was more than just the main librarian at Columbia who gave us the Dewey Decimal System, as you'll see in this talk. He founded a corporation called the Library Bureau that had profound influence on life insurance companies and also the history of medicine. And the Library Bureau collaborated with Herman Hollerith, whose Hollerith company eventually became IBM. So the history of computing is also part of this story. So with Dan here, I think just in spirit, I want to debut this research here. So impairment, when you decided to come to this talk, did you think impairment had a history? Impairment is often taken to be a word without a history. I think most of us use it that way. Or if it has a history, certainly without a history that matters to the present. It's a central concept in disability studies. I'll tell you a little bit about that for those of you not in that field. And of course, it's also a central concept in medical discourse. Impairment tends to refer to physical difference, limitation, or injury. In disability studies, scholars and activists treat this term fairly similarly to the way it's treated in medicine. It's used as a descriptive term, if not a neutral one. When the concept of impairment is critiqued in disability studies, it's generally placed or imagined to be part of the history of medicalization or the inappropriate pathologization of particular impairments or disabilities. Well, it turns out that the history of impairment is more bureaucratic and actuarial than it is medical. Doctors did play a role in shaping what we now understand to be impairment, but many of their early contributions had very little to do with care or even to do with molding bodies. Instead, doctors were working with actuaries, library technologists, which may be surprising, and corporate executives of life insurance companies to manage risk in populations and to engineer those populations for economic ends. This is an example, and tell me if I'm speaking too quickly, of what M. Murphy, an STS scholar, calls the economization of life. So these medico-actuarial and managerial teams exercised what scholars call information power, binding individuals to their data by creating records that stuck to them and influenced their access to resources throughout their lives. Impairment emerged primarily to serve American life insurance companies, who joined with Melville Dewey's Library Bureau in the 1890s to exploit and popularize a new technology, very high tech at the time, the card index exchange, basically a card catalog, but one that circulated. And they did this to pool surveillance data on life insurance applicants, people who they especially thought were impaired risks. And I'll explain what that concept meant. In turn, these companies were advancing their own financial interests by sharing impairment data among them. They were employing it basically to tame chance, an Ian Hacking, historian of statistics phrase, to gamble on mortality, on the comparative likelihood of applicants' deaths. In the very first decade of the 20th century, impairment also became a proving ground for computation through very large-scale life insurance studies that calculated the risks of early mortality using Hollerith cards. I'm not going to have, I know that Corinna Schlams is a historian of computing and would love this part of the story. I'll only be able to scratch the surface of it. But in addition to this, the US Census and railroad data, the impairment data for life insurance companies was one of Hollerith's early interests. So there's a lot more to be said about the history of computing than I can get to in the talk part. So I want to give you a sense of why I care about impairment and why Dan and I decided to write a history of this term. It's a key word in the field of disability studies. Within what's called the medical model of disability, in disability studies, impairment and disability can hardly be disentangled. So the medical model is said to, and the medical model, it's almost a fiction today because the World Health Organization and most doctors have absorbed the distinction between disability and impairment that I'll describe. But in disability studies, people still talk about a medical model, which they say individualizes disability and emphasizes cure. And they contrast it to the social model, which draws a very sharp distinction between impairment and disability, and takes disability to be a result of things like architecture, design exclusions, economics, stigma. So in the social model, impairments become disabilities only in particular settings. For instance, someone who uses a wheelchair encountering a sidewalk without curb cuts, that's a sort of classic example. Now, again, if you look, mainstream public health and medical organizations have absorbed this distinction by now. But the distinction between impairment and disability, which figures so centrally in disability studies and has for decades, it's usually attributed to an activist group in the UK, the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation, who published a manifesto defining these two terms in 1976, titled Fundamental Principles of Disability. And in this document, they argued, what we are interested in are ways of changing our conditions of life and thus overcoming the disabilities which are imposed on top of our physical impairments by the way this society is organized to exclude us. So after the 70s, as the field of disability studies emerged, scholars immediately began contesting this really tidy binary or distinction between impairment and disability. And Michael Rembis, a scholar at University of Buffalo, has recently published an article surveying 30 years of debate about the term impairment in disability studies, which I won't summarize for you, but you can look it up. It's a great article. And he comes to the conclusion that impairment is, of course, not a linguistic universal, very hard to translate, for instance, into German or French. Among other languages, there just isn't a term like this. Moreover, what we take to be impairments in English, Mike says, are socially created and historically contingent. Okay, so despite the significance of impairment as a keyword in my field, in disability history, and decades of discussion about its definition, almost no work has been done to explain the roots of this concept as it came to be understood in English. There's one exception. It's the 1984 book, The Disabled State, a great book by Deborah Stone, in which she linked the modern definition of impairment to workers' compensation law. And she reviewed the history of the AMA guides to the evaluation of permanent impairment, first published by the AMA in 1958, still a leading impairment rating tool in the US. And she concludes the professional concept of impairment represents an effort to define and quantify the elements of inability to work. The image I have on the screen right now is a graphic schedule for workers' compensation in Germany from around 1900. Workers' comp, needless to say, launched much earlier in Germany, also the UK, than it did in the US. It was the 19-teens where we start getting it in the US. And this basically just shows different impairments and their costs, their compensation values. It's probably very hard to read in the back. But it's labeled impairments with monetary values attached. So that's the history we've been given, or the limited history we have had of impairment. There's an untold, until this evening, earlier history of the impairment concept, centered on lifespan, life itself, rather than inability to work. Yes, it does have to do with inability to work in those AMA guides, but the origins have to do with life insurance. A century before the publication of the AMA guides and influencing their design, impairment began to be formalized as a tool for rating, rejecting, and surveilling people in the US commercial life insurance industry. Why the US? Unlike their peers in the UK, American underwriters were initially much less willing to insure what they called impaired risks, people who seemed unlikely to live to old age. In the UK, people could pay an extra fee early on and receive life insurance, even if they were considered impaired risks in the UK. According to the 1899 edition of Principles and Practices of Life Insurance, a book that was, I've seen at least 7 editions of, published by actuaries Nathan Willey and Henry Moore, the word impaired was, quote, an adjective used to distinguish a person who is unsuitable for the issue of a policy of insurance in the healthy class, literally below par, not equal to the average, end quote. And then risk in this life insurance manual referred to, quote, chance of loss. What they meant by that was financial loss. So insurers called people themselves risks. And an impaired risk was then someone who was denied insurance or charged in the UK and eventually in the US additional premiums as a result of their health, heredity, age, habits, occupation, race, gender. The noun form impairment was exceedingly uncommon until the first decade of the 20th century. Dan and I have a whole section going through everything from Google Ngram to old accident insurance manuals in the UK, other life insurance manuals. I'm not going to prove this to you. I'm just going to say it. Impairment as a noun form was an uncommon term in English until the first decade of the 20th century, although the phrase impaired risks had existed for decades in life insurance before that. So Dan and I argue that the task of identifying these impaired risks in the US to exclude them encouraged medical examiners, directors, and actuaries for US life insurance companies to start systematically cataloging impaired anatomical features and abilities that would disqualify someone from a policy. At first, these evaluations were based on the professional judgment of a medical examiner, shaped very heavily by the life insurance industry. There's a fascinating set of books created by actuaries, marketed to doctors who might want to get hired for, as consultants for life insurance companies, to basically train them to think like life insurers, which is a very different way of thinking than the kind of training you would typically get in medical school, not about cure. By the 1890s, life insurance companies in the US started adopting new technologies and procedures for office administration, many of them pushed by the Library Bureau and management companies themselves. And they adopted these because they hoped to streamline work and control costs in this era, when their policies started ballooning into the millions, they had to have more sophisticated management tools. And the concept of impairment emerged at this medical, administrative, actuarial nexus as a very compact, very discrete form of human data. And I'll explain what I mean by that. One basic administration technique that is at the heart of this talk, borrowed from the library sector, shifted record keeping to new file cards. File cards also have a history. It doesn't seem like they would, but they do. There are many books on this now. Marcus Krajewski has written one. Card catalogs sold by Melville Dewey's Library Bureau, initially to libraries, began migrating into other businesses. And in fact, the Library Bureau started making much more money selling to insurers than to libraries. A few large life insurance companies had installed card catalogs already for record keeping in their main offices. And in the late 19th century, around 1900, Library Bureau staff suggested that these file cards might start circulating. They all had already done this in the library systems. Why? Well, their idea was that insurance companies that used to be rivals would hide their information from each other, might actually circulate their copies of their file cards to have efficient and secret exchange of data about applicants who were rejected. No privacy, medical surveillance. But the idea came from the Library Bureau that was already circulating file cards within other industries. So specifically, the Library Bureau had the idea to receive lists of daily rejections from every subscribing life insurance firm, which they would then copy or mass print, alphabetize, and send out to every other subscribing firm so that all firms could keep these cards in a master index of people who were seen to be impaired risks and uninsurable. Now, the conversion of impaired risks to impairment and the popularization of impairment emerged. Dan and I are pinpointing this to 1902. It's very rare that historians pinpoint things to a year, but we're pinpointing this to 1902 with the founding of the MIB, the Medical Information Bureau, often mistakenly called the Medical Impairment Bureau. And it was founded initially as a collaboration among US life insurers to aggregate mortality data, on a bigger scale than the Library Bureau's idea. And it continues to serve as a clearinghouse of personal data today. When people rail against pre-existing conditions, it's often the MIB that is they're railing against. So the MIB took over from the Library Bureau, again, driven by life insurers, and the goal was to increase the data set shared among companies, and they began circulating what they called impairment cards, rather than just cards with the names of rejected applicants. And these impairment cards were very specific. It wasn't just a name of a rejection, it was very specific and increasingly long as years went by with what counted as an impairment. Shortly thereafter, medical directors and actuaries began to make impairment computable using Hollerith tabulating cards. And Hollerith was seeking them out, not vice versa. And Hollerith, the Library Bureau already made the cards for Hollerith punch cards. So these companies, the big companies, big data, big money, they were all working together, mostly in New York. So patient responses on medical history forms, solicited by insurance companies, interpreted in written notes by medical examiners, would be abstracted by clerks in life insurance offices to codes that could be punched on a Hollerith card for each person. And these codes referred specifically to different types of impairment. And eventually impairments began to be ranked and tallied according to mortality risk based on statistical studies made possible by the Hollerith cards. I'll explain this briefly. So cure is totally remote from this logic. unlike what people have said is the medical model of disability, with disability and impairment being identical, cure was very remote from this. Many impairments did become pre-existing conditions that would follow people around forever. Life insurance companies were fine with that. They weren't out to change that. They weren't out to treat impairments at all. Impairments were invented to help insurers place good bets using a very efficient automated system on applicants who were likely to be inexpensive. It was a form of impairment became a form of information that could lead to someone's exclusion from insurance and later from the workplace. And eventually impairment in the US also became a source of profit, a reason to charge an applicant a higher rate. The fact that key figures in the drive to organize and tabulate the world's information at the turn of the century, Dewey and Hollerith collaborated with insurance companies and sought them out in the making of impairments makes plain that mortality and disability were big business. They still are. And maybe I don't need to say this to anyone here who's a physician. And again, this history makes clear that impairment has never been purely medical. Often, this is a citation probably more for the historians of medicine in this room, but if you read something like George Canguilhem's History of the Normal and the Pathological, the story we get is like giants of 19th century physiology, Auguste Comte, Claude Bernard, who are giving us the pathological. In this story, in Dan and my research, it's really totally forgotten medical directors of life insurance companies, and even more so forgotten actuaries who gave us impairment. Not publishing giants, not scientific giants. And even as impairment came to be understood as a straightforward medical attribute, there were social factors shaping every single step of its definition. From the selection of principal impairments that included things like behavior, especially unsatisfactory habits with regard to alcohol, always a big one, to the factoring in of risky occupations, without acknowledging class inequality or racism that shapes those positions. And the mechanics of the punch card at the same time really individualized impairment. I'll get back to this in my conclusion. It made no room for economic or social causes or solutions for ill health, even though choosing what the principal impairments were was actually quite a social process. So beneath the seemingly objective measurement of physical traits, impairments signified to insurance companies in the US, private companies, the possibility of financial loss and justification for discrimination. So it's not just underpinned by an actuarial logic, but also a commercial one. We might imagine that people with impairments are those who most need insurance. They're most deserving of insurance. But according to the US private life insurance context, impairment implies that you're deserving of future injury and early death and personal expense. Dan and I have a very lengthy aside in the article on the language of equity and fairness in insurance talk that I'm not going to mention here. So the creation of impairments benefited actuaries, medical directors, and their corporate employers by opening up new avenues of business and expanding medical surveillance. So to just give you some examples, walk you through the archival examples behind this. In the closing decades of the 19th century, US life insurers finally surpassed their British predecessors as the largest firms in the world, selling policies around the globe. Dan, my colleague, who I co-authored this with, has an entire book on life insurance, a fantastic book that will give you a lot of detail about the history of life insurance in the US. With this new great size came power, influence, profits, and a need for management. In 1900, all US companies combined promised over $6 billion in those days, in protection on ordinary policies aimed at the middle classes, and another 1.5 billion on industrial policies designed for working class men, women, and children. So this is big business at 1900. And medical directors of the leading life insurance companies began professionalizing at the same time, forming professional societies, coming together for conferences and planning. And as I said, perhaps surprisingly, they increasingly began to cooperate with their consumer, their private, what was formerly private data, as a way to manage the unbridled growth that their sales agents were encouraging. There was tension between the medical directors who didn't want every single person, like people who were risks, to be taken on, and sales agents who wanted to sell a policy to anyone. So in 1890, in New York, Herbert Davidson, who was the president of Dewey's Library Bureau, who was already selling file cards and cabinets to life insurance companies for just benign everyday office purposes, wrote to the Professional Association of Life Insurance Medical Directors with a new proposal to establish what he called a rejection exchange or a rejection league, using the familiar card catalog in these new ways. Again, firms paying a monthly fee, getting direct daily mailings of cards. Here's an example of one from the archive with information about applicants rejected anywhere else in the network. There's a long story about people who discovered that their data was being shared this way. That, believe me, I'm making the applicants seem kind of passive in this story. There was a lot of protest, defamation lawsuits, all sorts of things when people found out their private data was being shared. And people tried to change their last names or misspell their last names to get life insurance from another agency when they were rejected by one. So there was a lot of agency among applicants too that won't come through in this talk. So leading US life insurers joined this rejection exchange that the Library Bureau organized, so that one company's negative judgment of an individual would follow that person supposedly from firm to firm. And on the Library Bureau's end, they had figured out that subscriptions were their biggest business. They could make more money on subscriptions, whether it was life insurance subscriptions or other kinds of circulating subscriptions, than on making filing cabinets. So the Dewey Decimal System was like small fry compared to this money-wise. So the Library Bureau was founded in 1876, not that long before the Rejection League came about, and they innovated in all sorts of library methods and supplies. You have to be a true nerd, which I am, to like spend a lot of time with their catalogs, their sales catalogs. You know, it's folders, different kinds of cards, filing cabinets, card indexing systems for every kind of business. Jerry Flansreich, a library historian, has shown that the rejection exchange in life insurance companies was facilitated by the cooperative cataloging of the American Library Association. Who knew? The ALA is at the heart of this idea of circulating, not quite yet impairment cards, but rejection cards. And because cooperative cataloging operated on subscription, this was what made the most profits. The massive scale of life insurance meant that ever more cards were going to be printed and exchanged. Insurers filed rejection cards, alphabetically for easy retrieval, to be checked anytime someone new submitted an application. Very simple and very effective surveillance strategy at the time that blocked most, not all, but most of those deemed impaired risks from ever obtaining life insurance from any company. One thing I found in the archive, going through the Library Bureau files, was that the life insurance rejection exchange model, so using human data, not just book data about books in the ALA, was so successful that many other industries that heard about it wanted to get in on it and did. So, for example, the life insurance model quickly inspired brass and iron manufacturers to start collecting and circulating employee data too. And they set up library bureau exchanges with coded cards, like the ones you see here, for secretly sharing information about discharged, fired employees. So about whether they were fired for their physical condition, being union members, strikers, drinkers, lazy, found to have bad disposition. I'm just reading some of the card on the right is the codes, and the card on the left is the report where you'd mark the codes. You would circulate the card on the left with numbers circulated. There was a lot of secrecy from the beginning built into these cards. And that was because life insurers and quickly found out that they would get in a lot of trouble if individuals found out that like their name and personal data in words were being circulated. So there were always these code cards that were actually what was being shared. And there's so many more examples of this. And you know how hard it would be then to get a job again and people would, there's so much more to be said about this. So American medical directors, after doing this for a few years, realized that they could actually take medical gatekeeping and turn it into a source of growth by doing what had been done in the UK and supporting insurance policies on substandard lives. So in 1896, New York Life started insuring substandard risks, and other companies followed over the next couple of decades. In the meantime, the medical director of New York Life, a man named Oscar Rogers, chaired a new committee among medical directors to redesign the rejection exchange and elaborate a classification and rating system for impairments. Maybe I'll show you a new card here. On June 3rd, 1902, this committee presented the idea of launching a much more comprehensive medical information bureau to medical directors representing the largest firms, and they all affirmed this recommendation, and the MIB was born. The original rejection exchange, again, only required the sharing of names on cards. With this new bureau, whenever a company evaluated an individual and found them wanting, they were required to share that person's name and the specific grounds for deeming them a poor risk. In other words, their impairments, and the word impairment began to be used, and these began to be called impairment cards. The number of people whose data would be shared grew exponentially. So now, even if someone's medical judgment of an applicant, even if they weren't rejected, but they were seen to have a couple of impairments that they allowed them to still be given a policy, they circulated that too. So even if any negative judgment, any medical evaluation at all was circulated and followed you around if you ever decided to change policies. Member insurers submitted data on every person registering an impairment, again, whether rejected or accepted, and these impairments were represented by symbols on paper file cards. Over the decades, there's many different ways that these look. This is just one from 1908. I'll show you one other one from the 70s. And again, these are like the cards Melville Dewey had evangelized to organize books. Among the impairments that appear in confidential MIB meeting minutes, by the way, the MIB is located in Massachusetts. Those archives are not open to the public. So we have not been able to look at their archives. And it's so secretive that it's very hard to find any examples of these cards in other archives or any like explanation of what the different codes are. So among the impairments that we have found in the confidential meeting minutes that we have been able to locate in the MetLife records are things from the early 20th century, like albuminuria, protein in urine, history of syphilis infection. That was a big one, real big one. Evidence of speculation, which was the code 807, meaning gambling. Lots of 808s. 808 was the out drinking. And as the years went on, the list of impairments and numerical codes grew. In 1908, or in 1909, the medical directors behind the MIB agreed to require that member companies submit reports about all impairments found upon preliminary or tentative medical examination even without signed applications. So even if someone like went to the doctor, but then didn't sign their application and decided they didn't want to get life insurance, they still had that information circulated. So it was really kind of like totalizing at the time medical surveillance. So anytime anyone appeared before an insurance company doctor, they were mostly unknowingly laying their impairments bare to all member companies. They might not even ever find out what their impairments were themselves. Here's an example of from the 70s of a hypothetical MIB card with impairment codes. This was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. And the fact that they still had to publish a hypothetical one gives you a sense of how secretive these still were 60 years on. And it just shows, coded report, John A. Canuck, 16 FB 20 ONT, 13 MY 77. And it's explaining what these numbers mean. Gallbladder disorder, the card, the impairment card, which is what these were, only would have the codes. And then separately, you would have like in your office an explanation of what those codes meant. So an important shift occurred when these medical directors teamed up with the actuarial departments at the life insurance firms to apply actuarial methods to the definition and rating of impairments. The actuarial approach to impairment imbued the concept with a sense of cost, specific cost, and it started ranking severity in very specific ways. Not just a seemingly predictive capability or regarding one's future, but also cost. And again, Rogers of New York Life paved the way here, turning to New York Life's actuaries to conduct tons and tons of studies. In 1898, he hired a junior partner, an actuary named Arthur Hunter at New York Life. And Hunter, and in 1911, argued that this relationship between him and Rogers was absolutely pivotal. He said, with the advance in knowledge of mortality under different conditions, and with the increase in competition among firms, it became necessary for the medical director to have a knowledge of statistics and for the actuary to learn the views of the medical director in order to properly compile statistics on the selection of risks. And at that point, many other of Hunter's colleagues, the other medical directors, agreed. So in 1909, the Actuarial Society of America joined with the Association of Life Insurance Medical Directors to conduct a large investigation of the mortality implications of a wide variety of impairments, this word now becoming more common, and Hunter and Rogers took leading roles. The study began with the impairments that were being used secretly in the MIB, but they started to generate more precise mortality data, which then fed back into shaping future MIB practices. And this investigation was called the Medico-Actuarial Mortality Investigation. I hope that's not my phone, because I always do that. And it included 99 medical impairments in its first instantiation. And for this study, impairments were distinguished from occupation, location, race, sex, and also build, usually meaning weight, on Hollerith cards, with 9 columns devoted to registering impairments, 3 to occupation, 1 to build, a couple to habitat. The introductory volume, you can actually read all of these volumes now. They're on Google Books, easily downloadable. Originally, mostly dealt with height and weight and a handful of key impairments. But as they repeated this study again, the number of impairments grew. So the Library Bureau had, as I mentioned, had joined forces with Hollerith earlier, in the early 1890s, to provide the cards for the sorting and tabulating machinery for railroad and census contracts. And Hollerith, in the Library Bureau, there's all this correspondence from Hollerith at the time saying, I want to break into the life insurance industry. In History of Computing, this is like my one nod for Corinna, Joanne Yates has detailed the coevolution of the insurance and tabulating industries, including the early adoption of Hollerith and punch card computing equipment for a whole range of labor-saving administrative practices, not just for calculating impairment. They also used punch card computing for other things. So these new actuarial studies of impairment were building also, not just on long relationships with the Library Bureau, but with prior industry expertise with data processing with Hollerith. The Hollerith machines allowed actuaries to quickly sort thousands of cards into simple or complex, meaning like multiple cases of impairment, to sort cards that combined impairment with what they called overweight, to add cards in a particular impairment category, or to pull out specific impairments by age group. This is what actuaries did. That's in fact the definition of actuarial, the pulling it out by age group for mortality investigations. I don't have time to really get into all of the things they were doing with computation, but it radically expanded how they were moving from just impairment cards with descriptive data to starting to calculate costs and risks associated with each and every thing that they decided was an impairment. So the medical actuarial, I'll just show you one more of these cards. There's so many of them in these handbook. Oh, that didn't turn out. That's not very pretty. Well, you can read the subtitle on it. The medico-actuarial volume, the first one on medical impairments, came out in 1914. This publication and all the conference papers surrounding it got the ball rolling to popularize the term impairment. Impairment had been kind of secretive and private in this MIB, on these MIB cards for 10 years before this. These conference proceedings began to be published publicly, and so impairment began to be popularized. The impairments researched by this study parallel the scheme of the MIB because they were drawing at first on the same pool of historical life insurance data. And at the top of this study, 1914, was still syphilis, followed by urinalysis results, then tuberculosis, then alcohol consumption. 4 pages were dedicated to different aspects of overweight, in quotes. Other impairments had to do with paralysis, insanity, I'm going to use the language of the time, cancer, heart disease, amputation of thigh, infantile paralysis, epilepsy, and quote, total deafness. It's interesting to see the categories change and expand as you go through different volumes. So with this study, insurers' gazes started really narrowing and their object of study fractionated. Actuaries previously focused on lives. A risk was a life, it was a person. An impaired life was a person who was expected to die at a younger age. Now they were considering the mortality experiences of bodies that were like bundles of one or several impairments. Lives were bundles of aggregated risks. An impairment was the rating system for these bodies, and a punch card coding system for attaching lives to bureaucratic structures. Insurers kept track of impairments over the long durée through the MIB, and they continued to assign precise predictive values to each impairment that they tracked. So if someone came in with a urinalysis result, they would go back and look and see, they tracked long durée data on their applicants to feed back into improved mortality statistics. And again, individuals rarely learned the results of this. So again, working with actuaries, life insurance medical directors were able to value each impairment, to work within what they called a numerical method for quantifying risk, which estimated and scored on these punch cards. You can't see on this, but there's a whole rating column. The extent to which a combination of impairments would increase the likelihood of mortality. The mass production at this point of impairment valuations quite literally attached a dollar amount to impairments when it came to rate setting for policies, regular as well as substandard. And impairment and its valuation soon moved into the new field of workers' comp, 19-teens field, as well as the growing spheres of health insurance and public health. And as the term impairment spread into other branches of insurance and into popular discourse, its industry origins were mostly forgotten. The numerical method that began with Rogers and Hunter was intended to also partially automate the medical gatekeeping decisions, not just pricing. So it allowed a clerk with no medical training to examine a physician's report, identify any impairments that seemed to be indicated, and then sum the values attributed to all those impairments and factors. And a score that was too high would disqualify someone. A score on the borderline would go to an actuary who would design a policy that would raise the price of the insurance. And this had an impact, this valuation, on millions of lives. Insurers ran another impairment study, a computational impairment study in 1929. Here they were focusing mostly on high blood pressure readings. The subsequent impairment studies were conducted in 1936, 38, 39, 51, and each study refined and expanded the list or studied the effects of different combinations of impairments. Mortality rates documented by insurers' experience and actuarial studies served as the basis for impairment values, and impairments could only be removed or their value decreased if specialized studies revealed that the previous data was wrong, that they had no effect on mortality rates. Another really remarkable popularization of impairments took place in the context of public health reform. And here the concept really shed its history and came to look like a series of simple medical facts. And a key institute here was the Life Extension Institute, the LEI, founded in 1913 by economist and health reformer Irving Fisher with the insurance doctor Eugene Lyman Fisk. And the LEI was a small startup at first, but behind it stood the massive resources of Metropolitan Life, one of the country's largest life insurers. Metropolitan signed on to guarantee a free medical exam for a portion of its policyholders. And in the meantime, the LEI began advertising its own examination services based on the exams used for life insurance, but much more intensive. And these exams studied impairments in the people examined and also revealed those impairments to them. And the LEI started advertising and releasing press releases, like trumpeting all these news of all these impairments that were being discovered in the American population. So for instance, a 1916 news story carried LEI's warning that its surveys had revealed conditions of impairment that are truly astounding. They were really the first institution bent on getting ordinary people to start thinking about impairment and thinking about it in like alarming statistical terms. Fisher and Fisk of the LEI produced a book, which was actually just an advertisement, in 1915 called How to Live. It came out in many editions and reprintings. Former President William Howard Taft wrote the introduction to the 1918 edition. And there too, they had a section on impairments unsuspected. And as their title proclaimed, among large groups of clerks and employees of banks and commercial houses in New York City with an average age of 27, only 1% were free of impairment or of habits of living inviting impairment. And again, here the impairments looked like life insurance impairments because they were backed by and drawing on the Metropolitan Life. So heart trouble, high blood pressure, albumin in the urine, infected gums, faulty vision, a long list. So one thing I forgot to mention, I'll just say before I conclude, is that at one of the meetings of the medical directors of life insurance bureaus, most of these firms not only sold life insurance, they also sold workers' comp and health insurance. So it wasn't just like accidental that this concept disseminated from life insurance to other forms of insurance. The same companies were selling all of those policies. And at one of the meetings of the directors, and this is in our article, but I cut that section and I don't have the date. They also insisted that they all start circulating all of their data, not just the life insurance applicant data, but also health insurance and workers' comp data to grow their pool of statistical information about impairment. the reason I'm so happy to have physicians here is I would love to know what the MIB is doing today. So I'll conclude and then we can get to Q&A. And the conclusion is pulling back to stakes again, which is to say, only recently have scholars in the field of disability studies, which has not historicized impairment but has critiqued it, only recently have scholars begun to try to redefine or revalue impairment or look for alternate terms. The term it's still a widely used term, even in disability studies, although it's so problematic. So some people have begun to think about the political potential of impairment. Some people have said the social model of disability ignores embodied constraints like pain, illness, and fatigue, and maybe it would be good to go back to those concepts and think about impairment as having either positive value or realist value. Alison Kafer is a scholar who summarizes this position. Other scholars have said, let's just get rid of the word impairment and take on new vocabulary for disability studies. Impairment can be a medical term, but let's have a different term for disability activism. Julie Livingston has used the term debility to encompass impairment, illness, senescence. There's other terms. And then a few other scholars have started like reclaiming the impairment concept. I highly recommend the book Diminished Faculties, A Political Phenomenology of Impairment by Jonathan Stern, a book in which he surveys a wild profusion of impairments, and he defines the term as a, quote, productive distortion of an ability that's not always disabling. And one last example of like revaluing impairment, Karen Soldatic and Sean Gretsch argue that the concept of impairment needs to be mobilized to draw attention to national and transnational forces and inequities that lead to the production of bodily impairment in the first place. So their argument is that there's an emphasis in disability activism on ensuring the rights of those with impairments in the global north, and it erases the way the north generates impairment in the south. They have a post-colonial theory of rethinking impairment, or a geopolitical turn of rethinking impairment. So there are new approaches to impairment out there. I'm curious to see how those will be affected by this history of impairment. Impairment really is still mostly used in a narrow sense to refer to physical difference or injury. But Dan and I, again, suggest that the origin of the term and the isolation of impaired traits are tied to the logics of risk, quantification, and info power in the insurance industry, not neutral definitions of difference. And with our Osiris article from which this talk is drawn, we really hope to spur critique of the actuarial approach to impairment. And why? The actuarial approach pits people as financial risks against each other, especially as the word impairment moves into mainstream discourse and even into disability studies. It disregards the universal premise of human variation. The rating of impairments with regard to severity is very problematic and works against cross-disability coalition. Impairment as it currently stands neglects unquantifiable or non-discrete illness experiences, and the particularly harsh historical stigmatization of, quote, overweight, addiction, and sexually transmitted diseases are phenomena that today still remain on the margins of disability community. And I don't think that's accidental. I do think that's tied to this history of impairment. So Dan and I are hoping that with this history, we can encourage further resignification. So yeah, the MIB continues to exist and share data about those a given underwriter flags as having an impairment. In 2022, the MIB website sports the slogan, MIB helps maintain an equitable marketplace for insurance. That word equitable draws on a very deep well of insurance equity talk that has insisted that the risks of only a certain amount of deviation from the average can be shared. It's an ideology that says that people with pre-existing conditions should pay more or be denied coverage. And recent work by privacy researchers, so like Danielle Citron and Sarah Lambden, reminds us that the MIB is really just the tip of the iceberg now. It was possibly the origin, but now just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the data broker industry and its role in allowing insurers, among others, access to personal health data. The sharing of data and continued research into impairments maintains a system that seeks to justify discrimination against the 10 to 15% not eligible for standard policies, and it upholds an ideology of individualized, precisely quantifiable, seemingly, risk that undermines the search for social causes of ill health and assistance, as well as appeals to solidarity with regard to impairment and disability. So with that, I will conclude, and I would love to chat with you about that.
We can run the microphone with questions. Thank you, Mara, for an absolutely fascinating presentation. And we'll open it up.
Yeah, thanks. I'm curious, have there been legal challenges to the data sharing, to the reliability of the data? Where do we stand in the courts with all?
I don't know where we stand today, which is what I was hoping you guys would tell me, but I do know, yes, there have been tons of legal challenges, and some of those are in, Supreme Court records, and they're publicly available. So doing this research, partly because Dan and I are historians of the early 20th century, we focused on that time period. This is a 50-page article. So if we brought it any farther forward into the future, I think the journal would have killed us. But absolutely, I mean, I'm not going to have the date off the tip of my tongue, but there in the 70s, there were records about like why certain things were considered impairments that were brought. Some of these are brought by physicians, not by individuals, by people protesting that the insurance companies are the ones defining with high secrecy what impairments are. There were tons of defamation cases brought by individual people who happened to find out accidentally maybe because they had a friend or colleague in the insurance industry, or maybe someone accidentally told them something. There were tons of defamation cases starting, as early as the 1910s, and so that always happened. But there have been bigger cases, with physicians and others protesting the secrecy of the MIB. And as far as I know, it still maintains this secrecy. I mean, I wrote to ask for my own MIB report. They did send it to me, but you're only allowed to ask, I think, for 2 of them. So you have to be careful because you might need one like at a different point of your life. And it was I urge you to write to the MIB and ask for your own report. I had no idea what would be on there. But I don't know, some of you in this room, I assume, know more about the present day MIB than I do. But it's the place where pre-existing conditions live.
Thank you. Since this kind of information really impacts each and every one of us in this country and around the world, is there any protection that we have from abuse of this kind of information?
I'm going to say, I'm sure if Dan were here, he would have even more of an answer to this, since he's done so much on privacy and the circulation of personal data. I'm afraid that the situation has probably gotten worse because so much of this data has escaped the MIB and is, there are data brokers selling our personal data, including health data, in different ways. So my sense is that the situation has gotten worse and not better. A lot of with every president, there are calls for getting rid of pre-existing conditions as a reason for higher insurance rates. So one thing that could change would be like a national call for certain, it's often a specific patient advocacy group for making changes to what counts as a pre-existing condition that excludes people from certain kinds of insurance policies. I'm not sure what it would take to transform the MIB. My guess is that it would either take a lot of patient advocacy or physician advocacy.
with the MIB, whatever organization had access to my chart, always had my charts, whatever health system involved with it. How is that data floating out there and available to such organizations?
That's a really great question. And I imagine that my chart, I use my chart. I know my chart, but I haven't done a history of my chart. My guess is it makes all of this just that much easier. My chart could potentially be the new card catalog. And I'm sure before that, there was something in the early digital computing that was really the new card catalog. And then my chart is a piece of software that has replaced it. That's a great question. I feel like in a way I'm hoping this spurs people to do the more recent work, since we're pointing at the origin of this. What shocked us was that the MIB has lasted for so long. I mean, I suppose many of the life insurance, I look out my window, I live in New York, and I see at night the MetLife sign from my window, and it's just MetLife shining into my window. So MetLife is still here with us. New York Life is with us. I've even gone in, they never let me go past the foyer, and they certainly haven't let me look at their records. But some of these big insurers are still with us. The MIB is still with us. This is big business. I don't know what it would take to change that. Yeah, I mean, the other question is, how much does this shape decision making for doctors? When there's the AMA impairment guides. If any of you consult on workers' comp, how different does it feel to follow the AMA guides in terms of rating an impairment versus the kind of diagnosis one would do in one's everyday practice? So probably I'm sure that most physicians are not strictly adhering to those guides, and there's there's patient activism, and there's also just the everyday life of not conforming strictly to impairment guidelines.
Yep. Hi there. This is such a fascinating presentation. I have so many questions. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask two of them. They're sort of related. So the first is, you track back to the roots of the word impairment to 1902. How was that term circulated or communicated? Like you talked about the process of automation with the cards. Like, how were the cards circulated exactly? Like nationwide? Like, how did that term get to California?
Yeah.
And then the second question is, are you talking about when that term itself, impairment, was first coined? Like, do you see, from that point on, do you see the definition changing over time?
So the word impairment it was not coined by the MIB, but it was very irregular as an English language term before that, including in insurance manuals, including in physiology books. It was very rare. It wasn't just a term about bodies. You will find impairment was a financial term. So there were talks about the impairment of capital by a bad decision. Like, the word impairment was used in English, and it was also used in signal processing, like the impairment of a signal. So it wasn't that, but it was just very uncommon. It was an odd formulation as a noun. And it starts these impairment cards, which if Google impairment card, you'll immediately see like old documents, like on Google Books, about insurance companies saying things like, oh, let's order 5 million of those, like huge numbers, because that's how many people they were dealing with. I mean, again, this was a huge business impacting most Americans, and especially when it went to workers' comp and health insurance. So in the impairment card, where people were documenting things called impairments with numerical codes, that popularized the term to doctors and actuaries, not necessarily to everyday people. As far as we can tell, it sort of breaks out of professional discourse through these publications that were I mean, open to whoever wanted to read them, professional society publications about these, the Hollerith cards, and then through this LEI Foundation that I mentioned. That's a New York specific piece of the story, but they were giving free exams, publishing books, putting ads in the New York Times, telling people about impairments. So that's where we start to see this get popularized. But once it moves into health insurance, workers' comp, you get an injury, your doctor says to you, you have an impairment. The people just start using the word about themselves, about other people. The word is, what's weird about this word, the meaning of it hasn't changed that much. It's still in the ICD, the AMA guides, the WHO, disability studies. Most words change more than impairment has changed. I'm kind of shocked that if you look at it in the Oxford English Dictionary, it doesn't have that many sub-meanings really. So part of what Dan and I are saying is like, hey, let's change this word. Like all words change. It's been 100 years. But it hasn't changed that much. It still means like a physical difference or injury or limitation, and then subterranean with financial risk attached to it.
I can insert myself in. Question. Okay, yeah, so this is really fascinating. Thank you. And I actually teach the history of insurance. I'm like geeking out on multiple levels.
You must know Dan, and I'm sorry that Dan's not here, and I shall report back to him because he's the life insurance historian and I'm the disability historian. But that's great that you teach that.
Yeah, so I think it ties to a couple of things. Like before we had health services research, we had accurate science, right? And so much of what we know in public health or in medicine at large is coming from the insurance industry, and what a huge industry that was, and how large. In fact, we've privatized like what we know about health and data and so on to these big business in like MetLife and Prudential, and all these are making money. So I think it's really interesting. My couple of questions, like just informational. So I know there was a big debate in the 19th century about selling life insurance to Black. And at rates that they were sold, because states passed laws that said that you have to sell at equal rates, and the implication was that Black people's lives are worth as much as whites, which was an implication that many people did not want to accept. So was everything community rated at the time, and at what time when did we start having differential premiums? It kind of seems like, what took you so long to make money off this? This seems like it was sitting right there.
Yeah. So we spent a lot of time. All right. So there are certain historians on the topic of race, and specifically Blackness and Black people. There are a number of people who, and exposés of what used to be called slave insurance, that I think MetLife and some of the other big companies also sold as a separate category of insurance. Dan and I spent some time talking to historians of health insurance, accident insurance, and former slave insurance to try to figure out if impairment really if impairment was being used in any of those contexts. And all of those people said it wasn't. It really was a US life insurance origin. And the US life insurance, the very early days of it, they were primarily selling it to white men. And Dan has written about this extensively in his book on American life insurance. So at first they were looking at impairments among a white population with the first data sets. Eventually, because like I said, they were continually expanding their policies to new and more populations. And once they realized, oh, right, we can profit off of substandard, as they put it, policies, then they included all, people of color, women, all disabled people, all sorts of other groups. I think each of those would probably take its own article to like get at the politics of like impairment rating because again, it's actually quite complicated how they're with these cards, they're trying to gauge mortality risk by looking at combinations of different impairments, and they combine those also with build. Later they start, I think it's actually on this card, but you can't see it, they start combining it also with race. habitat, meaning if you live in the city, the country. So yes, they do start factoring that in. How much it's weighted, I don't know, because we didn't, like, I do think that's a really important article that someone needs to write. It's certainly on these cards, but how like race gets weighted alongside certain impairments. I mean, that, you know, it's really important. And also how certain, beyond that, how certain impairments themselves, certain things called impairments with a heavy penalty are themselves racialized. We still live with that with so many things. I've been working on an article about SOFA scoring and ventilator allocation during the pandemic, and Dorothy Roberts and so many other people have pointed out that SOFA scoring disadvantages Black people because of the creatine measure. So this is a complicated and really good question, and there's probably racialization of some of the weights of the impairments, maybe unintentionally, but the bias is still there. And then there's also the issue of once they diversify who gets policies, how is race as a category weighted alongside impairment? Maybe you should, I probably am not going to write a follow-up article to this. We have spent about 2 years on it. I would love to see more. I would like to see, because this is such a big concept in disability studies, my field, it needs more research for sure.
Thank you, it's fascinating.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I love this emerging history of medicine, business and economic history. I'm noticing that your first big actuarial study is 1914, and then you said they do these again periodically afterward. I'm wondering if there's some connection with the new Beth Linker's work on disabled veterans and on posture. I'm wondering if there's some connection here with the effects of World War I. And two, do you, in these reports, do you see changing terms for impairment related to war service and disability from injury? Either in terms of sheer numbers or the kinds of impairments that have been categorized?
So my initial, when I started working on this, I initially thought it must have been either workers' comp or rehabilitation where impairment started. I was following Deborah Stone's book, and Beth Linker also works in that vein. You know, that impairment must be coming out of rehabilitation. It was only when I read Dan's life insurance book, and he was kind of using the word impairment. Well, he was using the word impairment in that book, but not focusing on it, that I realized, oh my gosh, this is actually coming out of life insurance. So one thing I would love to know more about is what did it look like when impairment rating moved into workers' comp, including veterans compensation? We know it did. In all the MetLife documents we read, we saw that the companies explicitly started sharing their impairment data among those categories of insurance. But then did they, I don't know the answer to this. Did they start doing, did they change the ratings in different situations or the valuations in different situations? I don't know the answer to that. Did stuff from workers' comp or World War I rehabilitation ever did feedback in, you know, make a big transformation of a particular impairment category? Probably each impairment is its own book, you know. And I should say, doctors were conducting their own statistical studies among their patients on a small scale long before this. So we also spent some time looking at that, like how did doctors themselves understand the risks of patients who had an appendicitis attack? And so there were certain physicians who were also researchers and were like, I've had all these patients with appendicitis. And so there were mortality statistics on a very small scale that doctors on their own conducted in the 19th century. They just weren't calling that impairment or attaching it to money. But they were thinking there was thoughts about mortality risk precede this. This just was on a totally unprecedented scale and start labeling a vast number of things as impairments.
Well, I think we're, got all the questions. So I'm sure the audience joins me in thanking for you, Professor Mills, for this fascinating lecture. We're the Corner Society. We're going to be here at the end of the month, November 29th, to hear our next speaker, Sharona Pearl from Drexel University. Her talk is Bodies and Borders, a long history of biometric surveillance. I think it'll be fascinating. And you're all welcome to join me. Have a light reception here to the side. And maybe we'll have some more opportunities to ask a few more questions and engage in conversation. So thank you all. Thank you, Laura, so much.
Thank you. I'm going to answer 2 questions for the people in the chat, but we can mingle amongst ourselves. I'll do it quickly. One person has a question about long COVID. I have a student who's working on the history of ME/CFS, who there are a lot of conditions that have failed to medicalize. They've failed to achieve a concrete diagnosis. And some people believe it's because of the precision, not from Hollerith to the present, with which these impairment, with which impairment, the kinds of things that could become impairments were like discrete holes in a punch card. So that's a really interesting topic. And many chronic illness researchers have puzzled over this. I think there is a link there. Oh, symptom scales. I have not looked into symptom scales. That would be a really interesting connection to make as well. Yes. Scaling of conditions. Does it start with impairment rating, or are there, I think there's probably like multiple lines through which we get continua of different conditions. But and then there was another question about pensions for the Civil War, which I think is probably similar to the World War I question, which is just, that's another category of insurance. With the pensions for the Civil War, this is Beth's argument, they were generously given, generously assigned. You wouldn't have been haggling with those soldiers over whether their impairment, their pre-existing condition meant that their service was discounted and they wouldn't get money. Those Civil War veterans Beth's argument is that World War I pension, the pensions were being drained or were perceived to be drained after the Civil War. So there was a cutback in World War I of compensation for injury and a push toward rehabilitation and getting people back into the workforce instead. So the impairment logic is really like, who do you just never give insurance to or charge tons of money for? That logic doesn't sit well with even with World War I vets, it doesn't sit that well, but it's certainly not with the Civil War vets. Okay, now I've answered those questions. Now we can chat amongst ourselves. Thanks, Patricia. Nice to see you.
Thanks for moderating that. Usually we have some there.
Oh, no problem. No problem. I almost forgot, but I saw the name of someone I knew. So,
Oh, it's great. Thank you.
it was fun working with like a lot of my work was never done this. We just, it was like we were working on